Everyone to the CG seminar with a catchy number of 147. And today's topic is the tertiary sector and the relationship between the subsectors in England. And there's every sign that major changes of some kind are coming. We had a important review last year, the Augar review, which promoted the importance of further education and the need to equalise the position of students across further and higher education. We've had a subsequent discussion in the country about low value courses and too many graduates going to non-graduate jobs, and the impression's been created by the ministry that the government would like to see a shift of some enrolments, a balance of enrolments from higher education into further education. And that's an interesting one because it's possible that the government, which has won many seats newly in the north of England from the Labor Party, would be pushing people who aspire to university education towards further ed. And to do that politically, I think it has to sell further ed successfully as a stronger sector than it's been. And to do that, it needs to materially put resources, a real oomph into the further education sector and put it in a position where it becomes a more attractive option to more people than it has been. So with those issues before us, we have an outstanding group of speakers. I'll introduce them one by one as we get to that part of the discussion. Let me first take you through the webinar protocols. As those of you who are regular participants in our webinar program will recall, the webinar is being recorded and we make it available on the CG website within a couple of days of the webinar, and it also ends up on YouTube. So your intervention, if you make one, will be immortalised. We also post the chat from the webinar, which is usually very active and interesting, and it also contains things which are worth keeping an eye on in future. Please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please turn it on when you're asking your question. We recommend using speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function. Write out the question you wish to ask. That helps us to identify you and your question and ensure there's a good balance between different questions and that all of our speakers have the opportunity to answer a question. At the end of the presentation, the end of the three speeches in this case, each of about 10 minutes, we then move into the Q&A part of the webinar, and we will invite you to speak at that stage if we select your question. The earlier you put your question in the chat, the more likely it is to be picked up in the Q&A. We tend to get a rush of questions in the last 5 or 10 minutes and someone usually misses out. But if you raise the question early, you're almost certainly going to be part of the discussion if the question is relevant. When invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself. Most important, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. So at this point, let's move to the main part of the webinar. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our three speakers, Ellen Hazelkorn, Rachel Hewitt, and Gareth Parry, and I'll give you a little bit more information about Ellen now. Ellen is a Professor Emeritus at Technological University in Dublin. She's a former Vice President of the predecessor of TUD, which was Dublin Institute of Technology. Ellen is well known to all of us as probably the global expert on university ranking. She has produced a number of major books, papers, chapters on that topic, very widely cited, much sought after for her advice and her wisdom in that topic area, but she does other things as well. And amongst the other things she's done is that she headed up a review of tertiary policy in Wales, which recommended a more integrated approach between higher and further education. And I'm sure she stands ready to do that in England if she has the opportunity to do so. Amongst her many current activities, she's a member of the Quality Board for Higher Education in Ireland and a former member of the Higher Education Authority. And she's a member of the Commission on the College of the Future in the UK. I'll introduce Rachel and Gareth subsequently, but at this point, let me hand over to Ellen. Thanks, Ellen.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Hi, everyone. I have 2 short slides, and the 3 of us, we divided up what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to kind of start off looking at this issue about thinking about tertiary. So if you could change the slide, Trevor, that would be great. So I expect this is really about thinking about tertiary systems and why we're beginning to think about them. And some of that has to do with the changing demographics, widening participation, active citizenship, older people living longer and healthily like myself, and all these factors feeding into increasing demand and widening expansion of higher education systems and a wider range of different types of institutions. And over the decades, countries have developed not just their VET or their vocational institutions, but also their universities and other forms of higher education institutions. And so we have an array of different kinds of terminology around post-compulsory, which is used, let's say, in Wales, where compulsory education ends at 16, or post-secondary, which is where it ends normally at 18, and so on. And an array of different types of institutions. And some of this has now led increasingly to concerns about a rigidity and boundaries between different types of institutions, overlapping roles, duplication of resources, unnecessary competitiveness, particularly as we look at different countries and different demographics, where we've got England is a good example, where we have institutions scrambling for students, and there's effective fight over students between higher and further education institutions and also different agencies. I think the other kinds of issues feeding into this really has to do with the changing nature of basically life and changing nature of the workplace, the need for and desire for people to come in and out of the workplace at varying times, come in and out of education, and that notion that a job for life being, as I would say, as redundant as education for life. And so from a policy point of view, there's an increasing interest in collaboration or encouraging collaboration, also from an institutional one in some cases, strategic capacity, joined up thinking. From a learner point of view, there's a question of ability to move across boundaries at different times, either initially to exit an award and come back in at another point for people who have been out of the system due to illness or work, for women who have been in and out, and so on. And so in that sense, there are a range of different questions that have emerged around system architecture and governance, and with this idea about creating what I might call our integrated pathways between different parts of the system. Now, arguably, colleges and universities could seek to do this kind of thinking about themselves and where they fit within their ecosystem. And a lot of these terms around ecosystem and so on have come into vogue. And they could do that themselves. More frequently, that tends to be done among private institutions. And we've seen a lot of these kinds of mergers just even among colleges at the liberal arts and other end in the US, for example. But public institutions don't tend to do that. And so, and arguably left to their own devices, institutions choose what's optimal for themselves, which may be suboptimal for their region or their society. And so there have been very policy options that have come in for lots of different reasons. So do you want to change that? So there have been, as I say, different types of options over the years. The California Master Plan is probably the most well known for people looking at that, which made quite a clear differentiation between community colleges, state, regional, and universities. And that and all these systems these approaches have plus and minuses to them. Their ability to be flexible, to recognize that over time that institutions change, and indeed qualifications and need for that changes. So these are some of the kinds of downside to it. But the California Master Plan is probably the most well known. I refer also to the SUNY system, that's the State University of New York. And I reference there Nancy Zimpher, who was the chancellor of the system, who coined the phrase systemness, which was the ability to look. So the SUNY system, which is outside New York City, which has CUNY, has 65 institutions. And it was the ability and her attempt to try and get them to work together in a collaborative way. New Zealand has done similarly with its Tertiary Education Commission. It has a single commission that oversees this. In other words, an overarching intermediary body. We move on then to the example in the Basque region. They've been moving around with this, driven in part or influenced very strongly by the smart specialization strategy, which is an EU policy about regional growth and so on. And they have developed a very strong linkage between their universities, research institutes, and VET, vocational education and training. Ireland has done similarly, but is coordinated largely, or will be increasingly coordinated through the ministry. At the moment, we have two different intermediary bodies, one for the higher education and one for further education. But the new department, which has literally just been formed in the last week, is now called the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation, and Science. But the important bit is that it's now pulled further and higher education quite distinctly together. And then we have the proposal that I made to Wales, which is moving ahead for an integrated governing arrangement on the post-compulsory side. So it includes the latter years of secondary, what I would call secondary, but it has a further education, the colleges, and indeed the universities in what will be called the Commission for Tertiary Education and Research. And the point of it is to try and get some kind of coordination. I suspect that's the best way. It's not and different approaches in different ways, but some of it has to do with learner and career pathways, transfer facilities, as I say, coming inside and out, assurances of articulation, looking at maybe back office functions, sharing infrastructure, sharing campus, enhancing quality, as alignment with the region, and looking at a range of these kinds of issues with the idea, I guess the term I use is enhancing capacity beyond individual capability. And I'll leave it like that.
Well, thanks very much, Eleanor. And you've laid out a general territory, which I think a lot of people will be interested in and will want to come in on. We have participants from all around the world, and everyone's got different mix of institutions in front of them. Great pleasure now to introduce Rachel Hewitt. First time she's been involved in our webinar series, and a pleasure to have a HEPI speaker, the Higher Education Policy Institute, extraordinarily effective discussion forum, think tank in the field of higher education policy in the UK. Rachel is Director of Policy and Advocacy at HEPI. Prior to her HEPI career, she had a career at the Higher Education Statistics Agency, HESA, our favourite data source in the UK. Amongst other things, she led on the review of data on graduate destinations and implemented the new graduate outcome survey. Rachel, your take on tertiary in the UK.
Thank you, Simon, for both inviting me to speak and take a part in this session, and also Ellen for your remarks, which I think set us up really well. I'm going to focus predominantly on the potential impact on higher education of the government's plans for tertiary reform and sort of the broader picture of what's going on in terms of the government focus on higher education at the moment and what some of the risks might be for higher education. But I firstly wanted to say, of course, it's undoubtedly a positive step to see more focus and more funding being put on further education in England. For years, further education suffered from significant cuts, leaving it both underfunded and undersupported, and that weakens our tertiary system as a whole. And so the recent discussion of how we can reinvigorate further education is definitely welcome. But I think we've seen much of the rhetoric from government on further education has been focused on pitching it against higher education. So, for example, Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education, in his recent speech about the need for further education reform, said it's clear that there are limits to what can be achieved by sending ever more people to university. Now, that might have just been a ploy to try and get coverage of the speech, given we know that there is an appetite for anti-university news stories, but it does play into some sort of misconceptions about our tertiary system. And I think there are a number of traps that we fall into when we talk about tertiary education in England. Firstly, there's often too much confusion about level of study and technical or vocational education, because of course these aren't the same things. There are many universities across the UK who deliver high quality technical or vocational education. It's just at a different level that might be delivered through further education. And so it's not that people can either do technical or vocational education or higher education. And the conflation of these two concepts, I think, often plays into some confusion in the way that we talk about our system. If we want more people to be doing technical or vocational education, it doesn't necessarily mean that these people can't be going on to higher education study. Equally, the changes that are coming down the line have often been described as building a German-style further education system. And of course, there's much to be admired about the German system. And we published a report back in 2015, which looked at how the system operates and compared it to the UK system. So if you're interested, it's worth looking that report up. But of course, Germany has an entirely different economy to that in the UK. The more generalist education system in the UK reflects our more service economy, whereas the German education system focused on more technical education reflects its economy more based in manufacturing. So attempts to just copy the system over to the UK are unlikely to be successful, and actually often haven't been successful in the past. And this mismatch of kind of the way that we talk about our education system and the way that our economy operates is particularly interesting, because there's been a huge amount more focus by government in recent years on labour market outcomes from higher education. And as a recent HEPI report that we published back in March showed, many of the policy interventions in higher education in recent years have been focused on graduate employability. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Students rate gaining good experience and skills that help them get a graduate level job as something that's an important part of their experience, as well as, of course, the learning that they get from higher education. And we have quite comprehensive information about what graduates do once they leave their studies. We've had national level data since the early 90s, where we survey graduates on their employment and what they do once they finish their studies. And that's recently been relaunched into the Graduate Outcome Survey, which, as Simon mentioned, I worked on in my previous role. So we now have comprehensive information about, we also have comprehensive information about graduate salaries, which we get through the longitudinal educational outcomes dataset, linking study records with tax and benefits data. So we have quite a comprehensive picture of kind of what graduates go on to do once they finish their studies to feed into this conversation. But this doesn't mean, however, that we've got a thorough understanding of what a graduate level job is, for example. Defining a graduate level role is complex, it's ever changing as the labour market changes. relies on employers being able to express the skills they need and students being able to demonstrate these skills. So it's a complex factor in the policy picture. The focus on employability is also tied in with higher education in England starting to look more expensive than in previous years. The student loan system in England charges students, English students, £9,250 to study higher education. However, students don't have to start repaying until they're earning almost £27,000. Their loans are written off after 30 years, so any outstanding debt is covered by the government. So it's a progressive system where those who go on to earn the highest wages pay the most. And it also means the burden of paying for higher education is shared between government and the individual. And we know around a quarter of students don't repay any of their student loan, and 86% never repay the full amount. However, recent changes in the way that the debt is accounted for have made the system appear more expensive. Previously, student loans didn't appear as government debt until 30 years after they'd been taken out. However, the Office for National Statistics stated at the end of last year that the proportion that was never expected to be paid off should appear as government debt. So that means that although there's been no change to how the system operates, a spotlight's been shone on the cost to government of people going to university, which I think has influenced some of the policy conversations that we're having. And this has come alongside government focus on cracking down on low value courses. Of course, how the value of higher education is calculated is a controversial issue. To date, much of the government's approach has been focused on the earnings of graduates, and this can show one aspect of the value of higher education, but it's limited by both flaws in the data set, such as not representing regional differences. For example, those who work in London will inevitably earn more than those working, for example, in the Northeast. It can also be criticised for being a reductive approach to showing the true value of higher education. But of course, from government's perspective, it does focus attention on courses where government are most likely to see returns. There have also been recent statements about moving away from the 50% target of people entering higher education, which was set out by the Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair 20 years ago. The motive of this is described as providing better options for the forgotten 50%. And while that's a noble claim, there are a number of reasons why the idea of reducing the number of people who enter higher education, which could be an outcome of this, is concerning. Firstly, we're at the bottom of a demographic dip, so there are fewer 18-year-olds in the population in recent years. But this is the last year of the dip, meaning that from 2021 onwards, the number of 18-year-olds will be rising. And if participation trends increase at the current rate that they have been, by HEPI's estimations, to meet with current demand, we'd need another 300,000 more places in higher education by 2030. If government's committed to decreasing the number of students entering higher education, who is it that won't access higher education? It's unlikely to be young people from middle-class families, meaning disadvantaged groups are likely to be pushed out of higher education, which would of course exacerbate the two-tier tertiary system rather than tackling it. There are high numbers of young people now entering higher education, but also many who do not get beyond level 3 study or A-levels. And so we should be looking at what we can do to drive more people into higher levels of education, rather than equalising the tertiary system by having less people into higher education, in my opinion. It's not to say that the higher education aspect of the tertiary system is without flaws, or that there are not some higher education courses that aren't serving students. There were some positive recommendations made by the post-18 review of education and funding, such as making the system more flexible for students and encouraging more mature students into higher education. And universities would gain more from working more closely with further education colleges in order to strengthen the overall tertiary system. But it's important that the reform of the system shouldn't be at the expense of the higher education element. And it's going to be particularly critical that we strengthen both aspects to support our recovery from this pandemic.
Well, thanks very much, Rachel. And I think you're the cool, dispassionate and effective presentation of those issues is much appreciated. You know, we look at the two great drivers of the debate at the moment are graduate jobs and low value courses, and both concepts are so difficult to actually operationalise as a policy mechanism for calibrating the allocation of funds or the distribution of roles of institutions. You know, graduate jobs, aspirational, highly normative, certainly very slippery. It changes over time, very contextualised in terms of what parts of the country you're talking about. Low value courses, not aspirational at all, derogatory, and also highly normative, and ties value in higher education to the inequalities of society, with the City of London jobs valued much more highly than the nursing or teaching jobs, which keep the country going. So if policymakers were listening to you, I think they would have the sort of dispassionate and intelligent framework which would allow them to move forward more effectively than those two very shaky notions allow them to do. Gareth, to put more rational light on things, Gareth Parry is the doyen of higher education and further education studies from the University of Sheffield, no longer paid on the staff, but still, I think, connected. His work has been immensely important to all of us in the sector, in the larger tertiary sector, in understanding the relationships within it. He's still researching the sector. His official billing for this seminar says he researches system change and policy reform in tertiary education, which is a good universal statement of his abilities and his contribution. Gareth, your take on tertiary in England.
Hello from London. And I thought it useful to remind ourselves about some basic things, particularly about the scale and scope of the cross-sector changes which are proposed for England. But a few preliminary observations. This is probably the first time a government in England, in the UK, has taken a tertiary approach to policy making and sought to explicitly embrace an integrated or broad notion of a tertiary education. Up till now, we've had separate lines of policy development. One styled further education, one styled higher education. Sometimes they are aligned, sometimes they are discordant, but they come from different parts of governance and policy making. Second point, we have a tertiary plan. Many people haven't observed it or talked about it. Many commentators have come quite late to understanding what the intention is in terms of system change in England. That tertiary plan has been around for 4 years and it's already underway. And lastly, the implementation of that plan is a long game. The strategic goal is radical: to change the shape and pattern of demand in further and higher education, but also in upper secondary education. So this is a tertiary reform which goes into the upper secondary levels and the choice making of students at the age of 16 or earlier. Next slide, please. So why now? This is all very well known. Over the last 10 years, as Rachel has outlined, further education has been at the wrong end of a funding policy, which has reduced the unit of resource in further education. And it's coincided with an argument which says that the general purposes of most colleges are inappropriate, are insufficient to meet the productivity problem, which is the English disease. Now, underinvestment has also meant a major decline in participation in further education over the last 10 years. That damage to the financial health of colleges was recognised by the government which did the damage, and it instituted a policy of rationalisation, whereby the majority of colleges were merged or reconfigured in order to sustain their financial sustainability or continuity. So you've got one line of policy there, which is centrally directed, which has overseen arguably an undermining of the purposes of further education, both in terms of its organizational forms and in terms of the students it's able to reach, support and progress. And then you've had a rather different policy line of development in relation to higher education. Over the long term, it's been about the drift upwards, particularly in higher education institutions, in relation to privileging or sustaining the hegemony of the bachelor degree and postgraduate education. Anything under the bachelor degree has tended to drift away and has fed an argument about the missing element in English tertiary education, which is at the sub-bachelor levels. And then, of course, we've had the oversupply argument, which has fed the current tertiary debate. That hyper-competition, that market-led competition, also resulted in the collapse of part-time higher education at the undergraduate levels. So here you have an example of two policies divergent in their content, divergent in their effects. And that was a crisis which more and more was recognized. The way the tertiary argument has unfolded is to suggest that England is different. Well, I never. England is different in having such a small set of provision at what is currently styled level 4 and level 5, the sub-bachelor levels. And what we notice in particular is that what started as a policy project is now an active political project as a result of the Brexit referendum and the way in which the play between further and higher education is part of the active politics in relation to so-called left behind communities. The next slide, please. So how are they going to do it? Well, the plan which I alluded to was styled the post-16 plan. It was constructed under a coalition government, and it is very simple. We want, the argument goes, a two-type system, and we have two bits of new language or old language to describe it. One part of a system, or a track, or a pathway, or a line of education and training with a style academic, running up to the bachelor degree and starting with the A-level foundation. And then we need to grow and create a separate binary line, which is now styled technical education, which will have both higher technical education qualifications as part of its portfolio, as well as new sets of qualifications at the upper secondary level. Now, this new technical route is referenced to occupational standards. In other words, the new technical route will play in a work-focused environment where the curriculum is referenced to the competencies and the behaviours expected by qualifications and apprenticeships and courses which are approved against those standards. So we have the classic example of an attempt over time to shift demand away from the bachelor degree and into a new technical track which will offer access to what is termed skilled employment, particularly at the sub-bachelor levels. And finally, the last slide, please. So, what are the worries? What are the arguments? What are the debates? So if we move to a two-track binary or new binary system at levels 4 and 5, who's going to win? Or who is expected to be offered more space in relation to offering approved higher technical qualifications? Is it colleges? But they're already in some difficulty and beginning to recover themselves, particularly in their post-merger forms? Or is it some universities? And of course, it's only some universities who play at the sub-bachelor levels. And those universities are nervous in relation to which way it's going to go. And of course, the way it will go will be determined in part by the announcements at the end of this year, following the spending review, when the incentives, both on the funding of courses and institutions side and on the student finance side, will shape the kind of system which is desired, or shape the movements within the system which is required. But one of the important things which is little discussed is that the current system has not just an academic route, if we want to call it that, and not just a work-based route. It has, at all levels, something called general vocational education, general vocational higher education. Now, to create a two-track system, you need to use the language of economists, you need to clear the market. In other words, you need to remove any noise in between the two tracks. So there is an assumption that one of the casualties in the way in which the policy will move is to reduce, if not remove, the idea of general vocational qualifications. What we're talking about here are long-standing qualifications in England, the higher national diploma, the higher national certificate, and we're talking quite recent, newly created, government-created, designed qualifications called foundation degrees. But all those qualifications serve two functions. They are both labour market entry qualifications, but for a considerable number of students, they are transfer qualifications, whereby students either move into a bachelor degree in the institution they are currently studying, or they move to a bachelor degree, usually in a university, to complete their studies. Now that transfer function is clearly a social inclusion dimension in the current system. Removing that element clearly plays into a different picture of opportunity for both students who wish to pursue an academic route and students who may well be finding themselves having preferences on the technical route. And then lastly, if we look at the architecture of this system, all of it is about linear movement. All of it is about traveling on routes which seem to be highly regular and dependent on straight line movements. Lifelong education and learning, let alone the future of labour markets, is not like that. Lifelong learning is about zigzag movements. It's about opportunities to be able to be mobile both in educational terms as well as in social terms. So there is a tension for me between a tertiary system which is premised on this kind of architecture and a lifelong learning model which has to be aligned to both economic and social change. I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Gareth. That was very, very informative, and I think gives us quite a bit to think about in a critical sense. I hope that Ellen and Rachel will get a chance to respond to some of your ideas there towards the end of the webinar. What I plan to do now is take the first 3 questions on our speaking list. I've got 6 altogether, and then see how much time we've got. We might actually, when we get to the end, we might bunch the questions, remaining questions, and then get each of the panel members to close with a response to those questions and any other final thoughts that they have, sort of round about 5 to 3. But our first question is from Mike Ratcliffe. Come in, Mike.
Hi. So I had this very strange experience of actually sitting in my university for the first time in 4 months today. And I think it's one of those that Gareth has called a nervous university, because we do work across foundation degrees, quite a number of level 4, 5, both ourselves and in partner colleges. And I'm interested in the division that Gareth has put there between academic and technical, as I put in my question on the chat. I think there's also a kind of willful division of things that are technical and things that are academic, and we don't see that division in the courses we run. We run all sorts of things that might lead you towards a technical qualification. If you're going to become a human resource manager, are you academic? Are you technical? How do those divides work? And then I think also a willful confusion about level, and a confusion between things that are done in further education and things that are done in higher education institutions, even though those things are of different levels. So I think there's often a real confusion, and sometimes I think almost willful in England, about confusing those things, so that they become things that are further education are not just at level 3, they're also at levels 4 and 5, and there's a real confusion. I wonder though, the particular thing on, there's a move from government to less specialisation, and Gareth mentioned it, at level 3. So the T levels are trying to take out a swathe of qualifications and trying to make them more lumpy, more kind of generic, which seems an odd approach given the specificity of particularly, say, the honours degree, which has got more and more specialised. So I just wonder about this kind of, I'd love the idea that we have a plan, but I just wonder in England how much sense there is of that actually working out. More specificity in some areas, less in others, a confusion between levels, a confusion between the word technical and academic. You know, we're really looking for a very well hidden blind watchmaker working this out in the sector, aren't we?
I might give that one to you, Gareth, if that's possible, and Rachel will get the next one, and then Ellen will get the third one, I think. Gareth, what do you think?
I thought that was an excellent deconstruction of the plan. I think I want to emphasize the power of a simple set of languages which clearly obscure the kind of real world situations, what colleges do, what universities do, and emphasize that that was a plan which I think in the early days had further education much more as the area in which most policy work was to be done. And I think as universities became less popular species of education, that relationship has been useful for government, not just to play off the two sectors, but also to begin to evolve an argument for placing more higher level work in the college setting. Now, can we remind ourselves, I mean, I seem to spend most of my life reminding policymakers about how the world was before the last 10 years. And there was a major attempt in the 1990s, something called the Deering Committee, to create what looked like, and dare I speak this word, a Scottish tertiary system, whereby there was a division of labour intended between what universities did, which was bachelor and postgrad in the main, and what was to be a new mission, a special mission for colleges. They would increasingly take responsibility in a kind of sub-Californian way for sub-bachelor and equivalent programs. Now that hit the rocks, and that hit the rocks partly because although there were funding incentives, the demand was unable to be stimulated quickly. The foundation degree was created to try and overcome that demand by a different kind of concept of work-focused higher education. And my point is, I think, that those experiments have been noted but never referenced. So here we have a much more determined attempt, I think, to keep open the idea of higher level technical education. I noticed that some of our colleagues weren't talking about it as higher education. So here we have the interesting tension between whether we understand something on the university side of the world as higher education, or something which is meant to be comparable in the further education context, which we don't see or don't regard or don't value as something comparable to higher education.
Yes, nicely said, Gareth. Can I bring in Richard Blackwell at this point? Hello, Richard.
Yes, hello. Hello, Simon and Gareth. Which of my questions do you wish me to ask, actually?
Whatever is most burning for you.
Well, okay, the very first one I came up with, it's perhaps interesting in the context that Gareth has reminded us about how policy developed in the 2016 plan. And it was quite simply that we've seen a lot of false dawns in which the rise of the Polytechnic has been predicted by people. But I'm wondering if this is now the moment, actually, where we may have a return to that idea for institutions that are rather higher status than perhaps FE colleges, but are focused on levels 3, 4, and 5, and definitely not level 6. I wonder if this is the moment.
Can I pass that one to you, Rachel?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I suppose as Gareth was implying, there are no new policy ideas; they just all come back around. So it could be that is one of the answers. I suppose it will be interesting to see how the response from government, how closely it links to what the recommendations were in the Augar report. I can't see them following the path that was set out in that way exactly. So I suppose that could be an alternative. I'm not sure it solves the problem of thinking how we think about the tertiary system holistically, and necessarily addressing some of the existing problems we have, as Mike was sort of referring to, in terms of where the crossovers already exist between FE and HE. And I don't want to see a return to a kind of two-tier, or a more emphasis on a kind of two-tier system. And I suppose our university system is already very diverse in the way that different universities operate. So I suppose it could be one of the outcomes, but I don't know whether it would be the most kind of beneficial overall to the tertiary system.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I'd like to bring in Maya Changsiliani at this point with her question.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everyone. Great talks. So the UK government's recent announcements indicate, obviously, that the policy in England is moving towards viewing HE and FE as a single system, which is, I think, an amazing thing to go forward with, and really promising in some ways. Now, I try to be a devil's advocate here. Normally we criticize policy and say how good our academic work is. And I would like to ask Ellen, because her presentation actually about systemness really brought this question to me. My question is, how can we in the academic realm do the same? How can we move towards bringing these two large domains together? Because they're totally different journals, totally different learning societies, and different communities. Some of us, including myself, do work in both of these domains, but this is perceived rather something rather unusual, I think. Similar, same applies to Ellen and same applies to Gareth, I suppose. So how do we move forward in our academic work to bring the two together?
Ellen.
Yeah, hi Maya. That's an interesting question, because the academic world has so stratified itself into so many different areas, which is part of the problem of how knowledge is in. But of course, life isn't like that. And we see that increasingly now with this whole increasing focus on looking at systems. And I would agree. I think it's good if England moved in that direction. Scotland has already moved largely there, and Wales is likewise moving in that direction, and so are other countries. And because students are moving in that direction, which is part of the other difficulties. So we do, even as the academic community, tend to be extremely narrowly focused. So when we look at learners, we don't look at them over their lifetime. We don't look at, well, I like to look at it in terms of looking at this ecosystem. So as I would say, kind of in the year or the time of the green agenda, if we pulled out those concepts around ecosystem, we'd see different kinds of plants and other parts of nature working together and having diverse roles. That seems to me to be a good way to look at it. I would just say on the other side, which doesn't directly answer your question, is some of the kinds of discussions, there's two sides to it. One of it is part of this culture war. We see some of that coming out in the US, where the Trump administration has been pushing again the apprenticeship model as a bit of a backwards attack on universities. But I would probably, to be a bit controversial, suggest that maybe universities aren't exactly innocent victims. You know, the predatoriness of the way in which they've gone after the areas, particularly with changing demographics, looking for more students, hoovering up an attempt, and the colleges have been left. In a way, there's also questions around outcomes, which are genuine and legitimate questions that we do need to respond to. And there is that legitimate issue of left behind communities. Now, some of that's left behind by the very nature of the policies of the governments that have been introduced, and not least Brexit is going to bring about as well. And certainly the government in England has jumped on that as a way forward. But I think there are genuine questions, and I think ultimately it seems to me that a collaborative approach, indeed, and even on the academic side, and looking at these issues in terms of trying to bring them together, would be much more helpful. I mean, from the higher education community, it tends to look very much at issues from an internalized HE perspective. There's very little that looks out. So even this issue is being looked at as, oh, woe is me, this is an attack on us. And arguably, there are aspects of that, I won't deny it, but there are wider sets of issues in here that we do need to look at.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Maya. I'm now going to bring in 3 questions. We'll take those questions together, and then I'll ask our 3 presenters to sum up and to respond to those questions during the summing up as they see fit. The first question is from John Anker. John, are you there?
Yes.
Excellent.
Thank you, Simon. So my question is, there's been a lot of press, as we know, about low value degrees, 50% being too many, too high a proportion of young people going into higher education in England. When are we going to hear more talk about the education we left behind, those who leave secondary education without 5 GCSEs?
Thanks, John. Can we bring in Nick Ratcliffe at this point?
Thank you, Simon. I think my question was just about the current government's current focus on so-called low-value courses. I think I'm a little sceptical about this, and I wonder whether 18-year-olds taking decisions about what to study, or indeed whether to progress to university at all, can really know going forwards what courses will lead to well-paid employment. The world of work changes constantly, and the skills that they may need in 20 years' time may not be at all obvious. I'm reminded when I was an undergraduate of students of mining engineering who were doing very vocationally relevant courses at my university, all sponsored by the National Coal Board. I don't think they had a terribly long career in that industry. So is there any evidence that actually that graduates are better placed to sort of adapt to a changing workplace going forwards than would be non-graduates? I think that's my question to the panel, possibly mostly to Rachel.
Thanks, Nick. David James, your question.
Hi. Oh, hi. Thank you very much. You hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes, well.
I'd be interested if anyone wants to comment from those excellent talks from the speakers there on the issue of using the whole principle of using the return on degrees as some sort of indicator. I mean, it seems just to be perhaps provocative about it. It seems to me to be a very simplistic type of human capital reading, very individualized. I know a lot of people earning next to nothing who are in one of the UK's biggest export industries, worth, by the government's own figures, over £100 billion in 2017, namely the creative industries. It seems to me a very odd unit of analysis to be using the individual and their return on a degree as if it were such an important barometer of anything.
Well, thanks to all three questioners, and we'll take our some summaries and responses in the order of the speaking list. So, Ellen, we've got left behinds, low values and low salaries and so on. Can you put a more positive spin on it as we complete this webinar?
All of the lows, is it? One of the, just an answer to the first one about secondary school and so on. I mean, okay, so we're talking about tertiary systems, but the other system is really looking at the whole of education approach. And that's why there are pluses and minuses around having, in my view, ministries or departments that look at either HE or HE in research or FE and HE. But the advantage of having, which doesn't work because government departments are as stratified as our academic fields and so on, but a whole of education approach should allow you to look at the entire system. Students move through that system from preschool until basically you die, it's from cradle to grave. And that's really how the education system should operate. It doesn't operate like that. Each one operates in its own space, and each one attacks the previous one for giving us graduates who aren't good enough to come in through our lofty doors. And that's a bit of a problem. I mean, it's not a bit of a problem. In my view, it's a big problem. And so there is that wider set of issues of how we incorporate and how we deal with that, which is even more complicated. It doesn't quite answer that question, but it's absolutely true in terms of looking at how the system overall is dealing with that. And I expect one of the difficulties on the FE-HE argument is that it's a largely, and the way in which Gareth describes it in terms of where England is going, is it's an increasingly reintroduction of a social stratification model. Because that's essentially, we're not getting the kind of mobility. So I sat on the review of the Dutch system maybe about 10 years ago, and we looked at similar sets of questions as to why we have students in places, and in that case, one of the arguments was that the students were really quite unhappy as to where they were. Well, there was absolutely no mobility. It's what I call the railroad system. Once you go in, you can't get off. There's no way that you can move between it. There's no articulation. Some of that is set up by the institutions itself, the universities who won't allow you to move from one place to the other. Relationships are individual or bilateral or so on. But a system approach would allow you to look at a much more greater attention to that. And maybe as a slightly different take on it is to look at CDFOPS, which is the European agency that deals with vocational education, and it has a much wider definition of what we mean by vocational education and training. It's not something that is defined by a type of institution or college or level, but indeed we find increasingly most programs, in fact, at university are vocational. There are particular, medicine is a height of vocational, so is engineering. They all vary, but the way in which we tend to look at it tends to be much more stratified. And the difficulties I would see with the England model is that it will reinforce social stratification. I'll just leave it there for the moment.
Thanks, Helen. Rachel.
Thank you. So I'll sort of pick up the later two questions, both about kind of the role of graduates. In terms of the first aspect of whether there is direct comparisons between whether the kind of skills that graduates and non-graduates are equipped with, whether one is better prepared than others, I suppose I'm not necessarily aware of direct research, but there is data about, I suppose assumptions are made about, based on how graduates and non-graduates perform in the labour market, about whether that is the case. There has been work done looking at kind of how graduates use their skills. That was partly done as part of the graduate outcomes survey development. And that kind of links into talking about returns from degrees and whether that's the best way of assessing higher education. I mean, I don't think it should play no aspect, but I think it's certainly very reductive to just talk about the returns from the degrees and talk about them to the extent at which the current conversation in higher education is focusing on returns from degrees, particularly from government. I think lots of other people, including us at HEPI, are trying to broaden the conversation. And one of the things I think that's really important is to talk about, when we have these conversations, we talk about who we mean returns for. So are we talking about returns for individual students who, as you said, David, might not be coming into higher education thinking exactly about their earnings in 50 years' time, or have the kind of perception of how that will play out? Are we talking about returns for the government? And of course, that is part of the picture, the conversation that we're having at the moment, because the graduate earnings play directly into how much money the Treasury gets back from graduates. Or are we talking about returns for society more generally? And I don't think we have necessarily as good data on how we kind of address that issue. So yeah, one way that I think we can push policymakers is by saying, who are you talking about returns for from higher education?
Mm. And finally, Gareth.
Well, I'm going to be brief, but I'm going to acknowledge how important the educational left behind argument is, and suggest that that's a question about what type of system, what set of arrangements are going to maximize the choices, the mobilities, the opportunities for students over the lifetime to be able to enjoy and gain from work and from life more generally. And my sense is that a system which tries to track individuals is invariably going to track people into less choice and less mobility. So my concept of a tertiary system is an open system in which a whole variety of providers are able to operate with different sets of missions. And those missions will evolve in relation to changing economic and social conditions. Last comment, who's going to do tertiary coordination in England? There are no obvious candidates. There are no obvious intelligent candidates where leadership in a tertiary way is able to be located at present. In fact, our newly created organisations, the Office for Students, was a regulatory body invented in order to keep order in a wild market for higher education. And then we have the other whale, which is the Institute for Apprenticeships. 1 year later, the words "and technical education" were added to this organisation. These are clumsy organisations, ill-suited and ill-adapted to thinking tertiary, I would argue.
Thank you for that final thought. Who's going to do tertiary coordination? It's a great challenge, isn't it? And maybe the government will move on that. Maybe that's what's coming. We'll see. I mean, as Nick and Rachel have pointed out, the discussion of low-value courses is a discussion about ultimately who's going to pay the cost of tertiary education, the proportion that's paid by the graduate as opposed to the public sector. And we know that all else being equal, the higher the proportion that's paid by the public sector, the more likely it is that we can engineer institutional and organisational arrangements which maximise the position of the left behind. So what's at stake, it seems to me, is not whether we expand tertiary education, because inexorably it will continue to spread to more and more of the population. That's the global trend. That's the national history. It will continue to move forward. The question is what kind of articulation there is between the different parts of it, whether it's an open system, as Gareth said, or whether there are stratifications and barriers which are quite firmly linked to the social stratification prior to entry between different types of institution. But I said, let's try to be positive, and I think there are many things in this domain to be positive about. We will, in the future, continue to educate more and more people in the country. There'll be more capability in the workplace. There'll be more potential. There'll be higher levels of personal agency and confidence. And we can be sure that the more years of tertiary education the people do, the more those outcomes are maximised. So whether they do their tertiary education in one or preferably in both sectors. So thank you very much to our three speakers who've really illuminated this discussion today. And I think we'll be talking about it again when the webinar program resumes in September, October, because these issues are clearly active in the UK and especially in England at the moment. Next Thursday, 2 days' time, we have our final webinar in the 2019-2020 academic year. And it's on the hot topic of employability, graduate employability and the pandemic. My sense is that graduate unemployment and underemployment, which is an issue now, is going to be a massive issue when we're into the serious side of the economic recession coming in the middle and coming out of the pandemic. And it may well be that graduate employment will be a big driver in terms of policy changes, some of which we may not be comfortable about. So the discussion of how to understand graduate employability, how to understand what was looming as a period of underemployment of graduates and many others, of course, in the workplace, becomes a very important one. And to carry that discussion, we have two outstanding early career researchers in Golo Henseki and James Robson. I should probably say early mid-career researchers in each case. And Anya Vignoles, who's one of the best known economists of education in the world. So we look forward to seeing you again on Thursday. We're very pleased to see the participation today was up at 77, which has been consistent with what we've had in this vacation period. So we hope that everyone will come back for one more time next Thursday, and then when we resume again on the 3rd of September. Thanks again.